Brexit another split from a kind of a system which is failing?
It is. It's a complex paradigm. So let's just think of the legacy of Europe. Europe lost its power after the Second World War. Germany, relatively speaking, was young, so it could rise. And it was born in 1870 post success against France in the Franco-Prussian War. So by then it was not even, 80 years old. Demographically, it had lots of youthful energy that could reconstitute its population, and the French were older and they realized they had to harness Germany, so they created this EU process, but it wasn't. It was a common market where the French tried to control the Germans and stop the war. That was quite right, but it missed the fact there was a much bigger enemy on the other side of the Iron Curtain called the USSR, and that enemy compressed all the Europeans into a common alliance through NATO. So they had commonality, even though they were different in different cycles. Germany was still rising in effect and France was old and dead, and they linked together. So it was a compressed partnership. Now, over time, as the Cold War fell, Europe believed that it could agglomerate, and it was part of the Ukrainian Revolution too, I'm convinced. It has spread far too far into traditional Soviet territory. Putin, if you're a Russian, was right that there was a threat to him because we gave no respect to a fallen enemy. We should have given them the space in the 90s and respected them rather than disrespected them. And I'm afraid in the West we did that. And we didn't give them a chance to have a new system because we didn't give them respect of an old culture. All of those things, I actually have sympathy with Putin, and they didn't really do us. They were not in the spirit of the McCarthy policy of creating a friend out of a fallen enemy. And we should have learned from McCarthy, and we didn't do that. So Europe now is in a state where Germany, the last engine, ended up pulling more trucks than you can imagine. There was greater agglomeration. The countries in the middle went demographically negative. The countries on the periphery that joined were demographically positive. And there's no social system in the world that's ever survived that dynamic. That's a declining dynamic. But what kept them going for a period was the German economy chugging along and its ability to export its technology to Asia. And that's disappeared now for twofold. One is the Asians have the same technology, and the other is the average exchange rate of the euro reduced by all these lesser economies basically still doesn't give the right advantage to the Germans. So Germany's in decline demographically, economically, the engine stopped. Into that mix, Britain's in a different part of the cycle. Britain, and I only realised this so it's the one big change and recognition is that Britain hit a low of 1970. Its paradigm is the seat of democracy based on sea power and the relationship with the sea and meritocracy. It's another whole discussion about what begats democracy, but our roots are the sea and meritocracy and democracy. And for a time, we linked to the continent because we had no one else. We lost our empire. We were lost. We were flailing. And then along came Thatcher. And whatever people think of Thatcher, she kick-started our economy, remotivated a whole generation to perform. And that was the beginning. We could have waited 100 years for her to come along, but she turned up when she did. And Britain shot itself up the curve. We didn't realise it. Only because we compared ourselves to the peak of empire. We didn't see ourselves really until retrospectively climbing up that curve. Somewhere around 2014, I started to understand that Britain was not behaving like the other systems in decline. And the referendum result or process that came along and the desire to separate fascinated me. And I very quickly worked out that actually it represented a new civil war, a new change where Britain was aspiring to be more. Now, the thing that really turned my mind is the Olympic gold medal table. And if you wish to look at the intelligence of rising powers, it has been perfect. The rise of an arrival of America in the St. Louis Olympics, the rise of Germany and Nazi Germany in the Berlin Olympics in the early 30s. You can see the USSR move up the medal table to those 75 and its peak of power. You can see the rise of China through the medal table in the early 90s. And then you must ask the question, how did Britain become third and second? There are no false signals. And my conclusion was the national energy of Britain, expressed through sporting prowess and other areas, is far greater than we recognised. And that energy is sitting there waiting to be more and grow more. And the referendum represented the choice to return to a global maritime paradigm from the experiment of continentalism, which didn't work for Napoleon and didn't work for Hitler, because the continent of Europe is small compared to the rest of the world. And the centre of the world that was once European and Western had moved to the rise of Asia. So in 20 years from 2000 and now, the paradigm shift that makes Europe even less relevant than it was. So all of those things have led to this moment where Britain asked to have more power to Germany and France in the Cameron government. They were laughed out of office, and the referendum came about. Calling that referendum was understanding the social system, and interestingly enough, the collectives in the city, who are far more collectively process, because they live in smaller spaces, they wanted to stay, and the people that lived in the country with greater individual spacing and individuality wanted to leave. Another quality of the early democracy of Britain and sea power, individuality in space through the sea. So what we were really doing was going through our second English Civil War, and it became more and more obvious, and I've always called three things. The referendum would leave, Boris would be the next Prime Minister after May, and that we would leave with some kind of no deal plus, as in terms on top of a WTO deal. It's fascinated me that we call it a no deal because it's actually a World Trade Organization deal, the very deal and structure that let China become the most powerful economy in the world on purchasing power parity. If you explain that to the English public, a no deal wouldn't really have any context. I do think there are better terms than that to be had once Europe realises that we are leaving and we can be a Singapore alongside them with a low tax regime, which is their greatest fear at the fifth or sixth biggest economy in the world. And it's very obvious that May never negotiated in good faith. She undermined her country. She betrayed the values that she talked about of representing democracy, and she created a bond through the Irish backstop that we could never leave with. Very different now with Boris. I think the Europeans will be faced with someone that's determined to leave, with the levers to leave through a low taxation regime on their doorstep. And I think they're going to be surprised at the speed at which we end up with not a no deal, but a leave and some process on top. And if we leave on a no deal, we are going to thrive. I have no doubt about it. But we're not going to thrive immediately because I do see a global recession, depression, not caused by Brexit, not caused by anything other than the Western economies just can't operate anymore. And the Chinese economy is being called too. So we could go through a very difficult dip, not because of Brexit, because the world is going through that cycle. But I think we will recover far faster than our European peers. And I think Europe will reform around a northern and southern axis and once more take on a different shape.